And as definitely feel free, toss questions in the chat, and we might get to some of them during the presentation, but we'll definitely kind of hit them kind of at the end, and in Q&A section. But wanted to say really excited. Thanks for having us. Really excited to be sharing the things that we've learned over the last year with y'all. We've been working with PT groups from around the country, and we process and read every sentence of every note. And with that, we process at this point, many millions of notes, and really excited to share how we've been using data and our AI to develop benchmarks as well as tools for running an effective practice. Because one thing we've seen over and over again is busy practice owners and leaders need realistic targets to help, and they need to be able to sift through all of their practices data and implement solutions to effectively track and improve their performance. And with our AI being able to really kind of look at those millions of notes, especially the unstructured free text that therapists are documenting when they clickety-clack on their keyboard, that's really helped us identify realistic benchmarks that can both target performance, but also time-efficient care. And, these can help organizations establish their standards and requirements for the therapists. And so today, we have Kelly Brown and Chris Hoekstra here. So we'll go around the horn and do some quick intros. Kelly, if you want to start.
Yeah, thanks everyone for having us here today. I'm Kelly Brown. I'm a physical therapist and the Director of Client Success with Prediction Health. I spent over a decade in the private practice industry. Interestingly enough, Bernie, I worked with Tom DeAngelis for many years in the company that he's with now in the Seattle area. So I know Tom and Janine well. And so I did the staff PT clinic director, regional director, and I was a practice or a shareholder in the group that Tom works with as well. So I was lucky enough to be a client with Prediction Health a few years ago, and I joined their team about 2 years ago. So we've been, so I now help our clients understand their data and know, how to use their data with Prediction Health to make the best business decisions for their organizations. Happy to be here.
I'll go next. So I'm Chris Hoekstra. I'm a PT. I work with Therapeutic Associates. I'm the Chief Clinical Transformation Officer. I've been a staff PT and a shareholder, and then ultimately the last 5 years have been an executive with that group. My role really focuses on digital transformation and business intelligence. So how do we get the most out of the data that we have? How do we look at our clinical practice and get both our clinicians and our business leaders the right information at the right time to make the right choices? And so I've been heavily involved in implementing Prediction Health in our practice and how do we get the most out of it. In addition to my work outside of PT, I'm also a biomedical informaticist. And so I have advanced training in end user adoption. I teach in a informatics program at OHSU School of Medicine in Oregon, where my research and teaching focuses really on how do we get folks to adopt technology, one, but then how do we use kind of the social piece of making the technology and the information and our teams all work together to get the most out of one another. So that's a little about me, and then we'll kick it to Ravi.
Thanks. And then I'm Ravi Atreya. Did computer science back in undergrad and ended up going to the MD PhD program at Vanderbilt, which is where I met my co-founder, Pedro. And along the way, we saw kind of all the challenges in healthcare. Kind of data was really messy and hard to work with, even when you thought you had like a really simple question to ask. And then, we saw clinical care. There were so many challenges in dealing with the medical record systems and really trying to help, take the best care of patients. And so we figured we'd, try to address those problems instead of practicing. And funny enough, our introduction to the physical therapy space was through, Kelly and Tom and their group up in Washington. So that was our first entrance into physical therapy. We got to learn about the space, and we dove right in. And so really excited to work with you today. And Chris, we can go to the next slide and the next one after that, actually. Just realized I wasn't paying attention to the right one there. Awesome. So, yep. So today we're going to review our recommended target benchmarks and how kind of we see therapists across the country stacking up against each other. And then we're going to show you how you can track the patterns our AI has identified in your own practice so you can kind of work on improving care and revenue. And then we'll demonstrate how you can implement a process to monitor, identify, and implement these opportunities for improving your practice. Next slide. So we'll start off doing a quick background on machine learning and AI and how it works under the hood. It's not really anything like scary. It's just math, which I get can be a little scary, but we can help demystify it. And then we've grouped the key benchmarks into three groups here that we'll go through one by one. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some closing thoughts and then questions. Next slide. So an easy way to think about machine learning is that it's just pattern matching. You have an input, such as a word, a phrase, or a picture. And then if you give a lot of examples to a machine learning model, it can learn patterns about those words, phrases, or pictures. And then we can give it a new input that it hasn't seen before, and it'll make a prediction based on what it learned from all the previous examples. And what's really powerful is that instead of having to tell the computer exactly what to do, you can just share more examples. And typically, when we share more examples or have more data, it leads to smarter or more accurate models. Next slide. And so here we'll start with a simple text-based, pattern matching example. So on the left-hand side here, we have the inputs to the machine learning model. And on the right side, we have the outputs, the label that we are predicting. And so, the inputs here are text, like a phrase. So here we have cute, fuzzy creature with a wet nose and wagging tail. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that that is a dog. In the next slide, we have a second example showing that there's an example, an animal that's bigger than a bread box with black and white spots and says moo. And if we remember Old MacDonald has a farm, we see that it is a cow. And then next, we have cherry red with four wheels, a steering wheel, and zipping around a windy road. And that is a sports car. And so here, in each case, we have a text input that describes the output. And if we were training a machine learning model, we would give it many examples that describe a dog, a cow, or a sports car. And we could train that machine learning model. So that way, if we give it a new text description as an input, it can make a prediction based on all of what it's learned based on reading all the prior examples, just like a human would. So then, what is AI here? So AI is about achieving human level problem solving with computers. And so, if I told you, hey, we built a machine learning model that can take in a picture of a dog or a cat and tell you if it's a dog or a cat, you might not find that to be the most impressive thing, right? Like that's something like, a kid can do. But if we took the inputs in to do higher level reasoning, such as, prioritization or planning next steps, that requires having like different motivations and using reasoning and knowledge representation to accomplish, different goals or tasks. And so we can use pattern matching tools to help achieve this higher complexity, as we move up on that complexity ladder there and achieve that higher level of reasoning. And that's where we really start moving towards AI. And so what's exciting is where, a reasonable person could accomplish a task, as we move forward theoretically, towards like more and more general AI, we could expect the AI to also accomplish that task. For example, reading medical charts and identifying, high-risk patients or doing other reasoning tasks around medical information. And so, how do these pattern matchers really work under the hood? How do they interpret data? They don't have eyes, ears. They can't use their hand to flip through a paper, a medical chart or read through a screen. And so it's really about numbers. The computer has to convert everything to zeros and ones. And so we can start with an example with pictures. So, images are really made up of really tiny boxes. So if we zoom in on the picture in the next slide, we can see, here, we can start distorting it and see that there's actually a lot of little boxes. And each box, we call that a pixel, and pixels can be represented by numbers. So in like the next one, we get the most zoomed in view, and you can see really that we're breaking this picture down into really tiny pixels. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see whether, what the input, whether it's picture or text, it just needs to be turned into a number. So that way the machine can read it and find patterns. And so here what we have are three examples of pictures. They look like tic-tac-toe boards, just imagine they're really, really old, like flip phones, super pixelated images with really blocky like squares. And so with that, you can see on the left-hand picture, that's totally blank. And so you can see that's represented by all zeros. The middle picture, you can see kind of takes the shape of an X, and you can see the pattern of ones that matches up with the picture. You can see kind of the X-looking series of ones with zeros filling in the other spots. And same with the right-hand side picture, you have a circle. And again, you can see the pattern of ones there. And you could imagine zooming out and looking at some kind of larger checkerboard, zooming out all the way to actually have a picture. And yes, it might be a little messy, but you can imagine as a human, if you're able to go and look at these pictures and learn a pattern, then a machine learning model can as well. And so here, if we wanted to go and build a model to identify if this is a dog or a cat, this picture is much more complicated than the last one we saw, but really it's the same thing. When you zoom in, you have a series of pixels or boxes where each box turns into a number, and the machine learning model can interpret those numbers. And so even when you zoom out and have this much larger image, the fundamental task is the same. So now that's how, a machine learning model could look at a picture, but how about words? Because, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but how many numbers get you a word? One thing to keep in mind as we go down this journey is that language can be really, really messy. There are so many ways to say a certain phrase, like hypertension. Additionally, some words actually can mean different things based on the context that they're used in. So that makes language very fun. So you can see here with just hypertension, there's so many ways that you might be able to kind of indicate that type of concept, whether it's high blood pressure or hypertension or HTN or high BP and so many more. And so that just kind of highlights the challenge when working with the English language. And so what we do here is the same thing that we did with pictures. We work on converting words into numbers. And so here we take low back pain and we split it into 3 colors here, which we call tokens. You might have heard word tokens before as you kind of see tools like ChatGPT and things like that. But what we're doing is we're actually turning these tokens into numbers. So we have the token low, we have the token space back, and the token space pain. And so in that phrase, low back pain, we have 3 tokens. And in the next slide, we can see that, for example, the token low maps to the number 9319. And then now the machine learning model can actually read those numbers. In the next slide, we can also see that a token doesn't necessarily have to be only a single word. A token could potentially map to parts of a word as well. So you can see in this example, we got supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And here, super, for example, is mapped to a single token. And the reason why this is helpful is you can imagine there are, in the English language, we have things like prefixes, like the prefix pre, which can, you can see a number of words like prefill or preserve or prefix. And what mapping that, prefix, for example, to a token does is it allows the machine learning model to learn a consistent representation of that subpart of the word. So for example, a prefix might actually contribute a similar meaning to the many different words that it's used within. So it can actually help learn that meaning. And one fun thing here, you can try this yourself on the OpenAI site, but here the fun thing, even the emoji at the end of this sentence, you can see it's not learning that it's just a semicolon, a dash, and a parentheses, but it's actually learning the representation of that emoji as its own token, in this case, assigned to the number 47226. And now we understand how words get turned into numbers. And that's really the concept behind ChatGPT and other, generative AI methods like, large language models, which what they're doing is predicting the next token for a sequence of tokens that it takes in. And so kind of in many ways, that's how we do it as humans. So if you had the phrase, we finish each other's blank, you as a human might read those previous tokens and try to predict what the next token should be. And of course, you can see that that next token should be sandwiches. We all know that one. So what's exciting is that when a model is fed a very, very large amount of data, it can learn a whole lot of patterns. And it can learn so many patterns that it can return what looks like more advanced reasoning. So here, when we especially train these large language models with a lot of, well-organized healthcare information, it can actually learn an embedding of the knowledge kind of behind it and the language behind those topics to be able to provide kind of really valuable information back. And it does, like a human does, the best way to know what the next token should be is it's going to go and read at what was said beforehand to predict what the next token should be. And so in this example that we have here, you can see we are basically putting down a list of interventions, a list of exercises and their descriptions for what a good, good exercises for various diagnoses could look like. And it's able to organize that information and present it back in a table format. And then in the next example, we have the same thing where it's able to now provide information on the sets and reps that would be valuable for a certain type of patient. And so we can use this in the question answering, we can use this for question answering, which is great. In the next example, you can also see we're starting to use it to help write documentation for providers. And we're excited to share some examples of that with you today as we kind of go through the presentation. But that here is a little bit of background on how AI works. And so with that, excited to hand things off to Chris to kick us off with how we can help start driving improvement with our practice.
Awesome. Thanks, Rabbit. So as I said in the beginning of my introduction, my goal at Therapeutic Associates and kind of the path I've taken over the last 12 to 15 years has been one of how do we apply technology to the lives of our providers and ultimately our organizations to make our lives better and then make what they do more efficient. So put another way, how do we make the technology make our providers look good rather than force our providers to be servants to whether it's your EHR or AI and those sorts of things. So really, how do we do this? How can we get happy patients and strong practice finances? The key is with focus, one, and for today, we're going to suggest that the first place to start might just simply be on differences in our CPT codes, and one being functional activities or therapeutic activities. So we're going to start with a model here to show you how we can just hyper focus on one thing and have multi-level impacts on the practice. So one thing we think about is the most commonly coded codes that we use in CPT codes in our follow-up visits. Evaluation is slightly different, but not much. We're going to have 4 main codes that come up the most, right? So we're going to have manual therapy, we're going to have therapeutic exercise, we're going to have therapeutic activities, and we're going to have neuromuscular re-education. There's a spattering of all kinds of other codes, modalities, and otherwise specialty codes, group codes, but by and large, these are the ones that make up the vast majority of physical therapy practice. If we take a step back and we just say, okay, well, over the life of an episode, how should those ratio out to one another? And we treat function. As physical therapists, we treat function over the whole episode. It might be in the early phases, we focus on pain or very specific isolated strengthening things, but towards the end of an episode and what should be the majority of the episode, we should be focusing on functional activity. So that ties to those therapeutic activities, neuromuscular re-ed type codes. The nice thing, CMS, at least as it stands right now, will weight those codes more heavily via their RVUs, and then their RVUs being weighted more heavily reimburse us more. We can get into a whole conversation about what's right and what's wrong about the current process, but for focus today, therapeutic activities and neuromuscular re-education pay better than the other ones. They're also more functional. That's why they pay better, and that should be the focus of what we do. So we can think about over the life of an episode, just from a clinical practice standpoint, around 60% of our codes, or at least more than half of our codes should be these high value codes, these functional based codes. leaving the residual 40% to be the therapeutic exercise manual therapy. Again, we're going to get a spattering of modalities and other stuff, but as a percentage compared to these, that's really, really tiny. So we're going to focus on these 4 codes in our example going forward. So I'll orient you to this slide a little bit, and then the few of the next slides kind of work on this. So one thing to consider on the x-axis, kind of down here, we have different groups and how they code. And so we've got the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, the 75th percentile. That's as a basis of what percentage are they billing therapeutic activities and neuromuscular reeducation. So you can see these green and blue bars are bigger on the right than they are on the left. Those green and blue bars correspond to neuromuscular reeducation and therapeutic activities up here. And so our middle group, the median group, halfway through, those practices on the average will see about 49% of their codes as therapeutic activities. So we'll draw a box down here. Put the other way, those that are less than half, these are those folks that have lower. If we get down to the 25th percentile, these folks are down around 35% of their codes. A significant minority of their codes are those high value codes. On the other side, the 75th percentile up here, those folks are pushing high 60s to 70%. So this 75th percentile is kind of that target just from good PT practice over the life of an episode that we say most folks should be. Now, if you get a post-op patient day 1, post-op ACL, you're not going to do much function, right? We're doing more manual therapy, pain modulation, but over the life of that episode, you should be doing much more functional activities towards the tail than the pain modulating things that you did at the beginning. And so there's a big gap here between this on the bottom in the 25th percentile and this one up here at the 75th percentile hitting that 60% mark. Put another way, if we change the y-axis, now what we're looking at is dollars. So this is basically the amount that you're getting reimbursed per month per PT when those PTs treat a certain way. So those PTs that have a very small amount of those high value codes are making less per month than those that have a high value up here. Now, we need to be careful. We're not saying, and you shouldn't as a practice owner, push your folks to say, well, if 60% is good, I can get more money at 90%, so I should put you up in the 90th percentile, because you also run an audit risk when you get up there. When you start looking different, when you get out into a tail, you know Ravi and his team do great AI and machine learning. Payers are doing the same thing. And so when they look at how you code and you look like an outlier, they're going to start to criticize your notes and your billing, probably not your notes so much unless you have to submit to them, some do, but they're going to start criticizing you to say, why are you different? And so this is where some of the tools can help validate that, but we're not saying people on the average should be up in this top side. They should be right around this 60%, which is here. So from a financial standpoint, if let's say there's from this 25th percentile that are seeing roughly 30% being the high value codes up to 60, there's a delta here of about $1,700 just from a practice standpoint in opportunity if you could move your practitioners from this 25th percentile up to the 75th percentile. If we play that out a little bit over the entire clinic, if we say most clinics have about 2.3 providers in them, just national average, we have $1,700 per provider. So you multiply those two together times 12 months, that's $47,000 in added revenue opportunity you have if all you did was get your folks to focus on getting that shift to what we already say is the right shift, is trying to get them to about that 60% high value codes. The key here is you don't have to focus on writing them on their units. I need you to build more units. You don't need to ride them on. You need to see your net fee per visit. I need you to ride your net fee per visit. All you do is say, we all know we treat function. We all know that we should be doing more function than other things. If you can see their data, we can say, here's where you are compared to where we want to be, where we all agree 60% is where we want to be. And if all you do is work on just do what we know is right, on the average across clinics, you're going to see a $47,000 increase in revenue each year. Okay, so I will get rid of my annotations here and we will give this off to Kelly.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. So one of the things we know, to Chris's point, if we really want our therapist to just really focus on coding for what they're doing, we need to actually know what they're doing and where there might be missing the mark. And so here's where we can actually, one of the most challenging things in private practice is ensuring the correct CPT code is selected for the interventions that were performed. So we're going to talk about this in kind of like a Goldilocks issue. So where we have a too cold here, which is like an opportunity where you're doing a TheraX, you're billing a TheraX, but you're actually doing a therapeutic activity or neuro. So you're actually under coding. So the care is inaccurately coded, but it's a too cold opportunity. If we go to the next slide, we then also have too hot opportunity, where you are coding for a higher value code, but you don't have the appropriate documentation to justify that. And so on the next slide, what we're really trying to find is, where are we accurately documenting for the code that we did? Where are we sitting in that just right kind of area for our therapist? And how do we identify that? And so what we kind of look at this is, we're going to talk about this as an opportunity and then as a risk. So you can imagine there's opportunity, obviously, from a revenue aspect for those too cold. And then, of course, there's a risk problem, a compliance risk when it comes to too many of those kind of on that end, that right side of the graphs that Chris was going over, where you are coding the higher value codes, but you don't have the justification for that. So on the next slide, we're actually highlighting how our AI model is actually reading the interventions to predict which CPT code could be utilized. So back to what Robbie highlighted earlier in the presentation, we are, reading this, the AI is reading the specific words within the sentences and then applying value to that. And so if we go to the next section on here, you'll see that single leg standing, tactile cueing, and Trendelenburg all have been picked up as keywords that would predict the CPT code neuromuscular reeducation. And so what we're actually seeing here is we can use the AI to interpret the words to give it the most context to predict the actual codes. If we go to the next section here, we're actually going to start to, one of the things that we've done is we've actually put it together in the next couple of slides. We put together some of the most common words that we've seen that are discordant. So I'm going to define a couple phrases here. At PPS, I joked, like, I was on stage with Chris and Robbie. I've got 2 PhDs. So I just want to do some definition here for those of us that didn't go through all the stats and stuff that these brilliant gentlemen did. But discordant and concordant, we're going to use those 2 words quite a bit in the presentation moving forward. Discordant coding is where we have therapists that are selecting codes that does not align with our AI. So it's discordant. And then concordant on the flip side of that would be where it does align with our AI. So we are going to be highlighting discordant therapists and concordant therapists that actually align their CPT coding interventions with what our AI would predict. So if we move to the next slide, excuse me, I'm moving into a cold where I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to make it through this presentation. I know it, but excuse me as I clear my throat. In this slide, what we're showing are examples of discordant phrases where a therapist is coding. This is a too cold example. A therapist is coding therapeutic exercise, and there's an opportunity to build therapeutic activity. These are some of the most common things we see in our examples that we've analyzed. Step ups, anterior step ups, monster walks, mini squats. A lot of these things are functional based exercises, but we're seeing the therapists are not coding them as therapeutic activity. They're coding them as therapeutic exercise. If we move to the next example, here's another one where we're actually flipping that. So we're showing a too hot example here. So this is where therapists are coding for therapeutic activity, but it doesn't have the justification for that. So we would recommend that it's a therapeutic exercise, or that's how we're determining this. So this is like external rotation, stretches, cardiovascular exercise, new step, a lot of these things that are very, strength or range of motion based exercises with no functional justification. And then the final example we have here on the next slide is another example of too cold, where we have TheraX and where our model is predicting there's opportunity for neuro. With this particular example, and we see this all the time, where therapists are doing any sort of types cueing, verbal, tactile cueing, balance, or stabilization postural exercises, where there is the justification and there's, within the definition of neuro, you can code all of these as neuro. We're seeing this is a high frequency where we're seeing these activities are coded as TheraX, but they have the opportunity to be neuro. So then as we kind of move into here, what does the charge capture data look like for the therapist to agree with the AI? So here's where Chris will now review kind of the graphs that we had before, but instead of looking at all the therapists, we're now going to compare those to the therapists that are concordant with our AI. And actually we're seeing like who agree with our AI and what did their actual charge capture data look like? So I'll hand it back over to Chris.
Great, thanks, Kelly. So what we're looking at here is we've shifted this graph to only represent those folks who their coding agrees with the AI recommendation at least 80% of the time. We're not saying 100%, but when you look across all their charts, what they code, whether they coded TheraX, their activities, neuromuscular re-ed, or manual therapy, what they coded matches when we read the description of what they did at least 80% of the time. And so that's that black line here. It's shifted up to kind of see that difference. So again, on the bottom are our therapeutic activities and neuromuscular re-ed put together. On the top are the manual therapy and therapeutic exercise. As a reference, this dotted line is what the non-cordant or the discordant individuals coded, or all PTs together. So we lump everybody back together. This is back to that first chart. So you can see here, there's a pretty significant difference in the percentage of coding when all we look at is, did they agree with what AI said they should? We didn't say that they changed their mind because AI suggested they should take something they build as TheraX and put it to their activities. We just simply said, did their code match what they described? And so there's a pretty significant difference here in that you can see the 60% that was way up at the 75th percentile for all therapists. That 60% actually shows up way down here at about the 37th percentile for those concordant folks. Or put another way, those people that agree, the low end are billing 60% their activities neuromuscular re-ed. If we go back up to the middle group, that kind of the middle of all of our providers, my slide here, we can do the same thing that we did with the dollars, and we can do this slant, but ultimately we've just shifted everything to the left for this concordant group, meaning that if we start to also get someone to agree in their documentation what they coded, and we talk to them about the differences between therapeutic activities and neuromuscular re-ed, we have a lot more room to move before we stick them way out here in the tail. If we put the dollars on here, we can see that there's even more opportunity cost, another $1,700 if we just take those concordant providers and slide them from the 25th percentile up to the 50th percentile. So we stack those together. We had $47,000 per year was what you could make if all you did was help the individual think about the difference between therapeutic activities and neuromuscular re-ed. And if we have concordant care, that's another $47,000. Now we're over $90,000 in opportunity improvement in revenue when all you did was say, make sure you know the difference between therapeutic activities and neuromuscular re-ed, and we should be doing more functional things. And hey, make sure that what you write to describe what you did matches the code that you put. We haven't told the folks to bill more. We haven't told the folks to make sure that your RVU is higher. And again, we haven't talked about net fee, but you've made yourself over $90,000 per year just by focusing on those two things. So also, how is the CPT coding associated? And let me get rid of this annotation. I thought it was cool until it sticks on the screen when you go. That's a design flaw here. So let me get rid of that. There we go. So how is CPT coding associated with productivity in patient care? So another graph we can look here. We have the percentiles again down at the bottom. And now we have the average number of units for those big four codes. So what percent, the number of units that they bill, how many total units they bill, not per visit now, this is total units. The red line is going to be those non-cord or those discordant providers. The blue line is those concordant. That's the only differentiation that we made. And we can see that there's typically 161 more units billed per therapist per month when we just differentiate. Or put another way, those people who describe well what they're doing, that's the only differentiator we make, bill on average 161 more units per month than those who don't explain well what they're doing, as defined by the AI. Put that in a monetary point, if we just take a typical visit based on our normal RVUs, this is taking payer differences out. This is just based on RVU differences. This is now $5,750 more per month when all you did again was focus on that difference in being thoughtful about your documentation versus those that aren't. And then another way to look at this is overall episode length. And so one thing that we have a pandemic problem with in the profession of physical therapy is this lost follow-up. These patients who see us 1 or 2 times and poof, they're gone. The provider didn't get to really know them, so they don't even know they're gone unless you have great systems to track them. The patient might not have really even been able to experience the value of physical therapy, so now they're telling people PT didn't help. And so we want folks to get a full episode of care. So when all we do here is we compare those individuals on the colors, we'll describe these. The bottom line is those who have a median, those providers that have a median visits per episode of 1 to 3, right? Or they have a lot of their patients leaving early. And then this other one is those therapists who have a median visits per episode of 8 to 10. Or again, they're keeping at least a typical PT episode length. What we see here is the y-axis is now the percentage of their visits that were therapeutic activities and neuromuscular reeducation. And one thing we see here in that group where they lose their patients early is over the length of their episodes, those PTs episodes from visit 1 on the left to visit 5 here, you see that the percentage of those high value codes as the visits go on get less and less. Or put another way, they do less valuable stuff at the end of their care than they do at the beginning. That's backwards from what it should be, right? Again, if we take that ACL patient, we should say, all right, I might need to start with pain modulation and some focused exercise early on, but pretty quick, and certainly towards the end of my visits, I should be getting to functional things. That pans out because those providers who on the average have 8 to 10 visits in their episode, you can see that it goes slightly up as they increase from visit 1 to 5. We didn't carry it out any further than that, but it shows a point pretty clear just on those first 5 visits. So again, we've now got another opportunity cost here because now not only are we looking at what those therapists can do with the patients that they have, but those patients that they have will stay for a full episode. You're going to get more visits. That gives you an opportunity of an additional $10,000 per month based on the fact that your number of new patients that we typically have around 13, that's a conservative number in some. And if you add those roughly 6 additional visits to those 13 new patients times a typical net fee of whatever yours would be, we threw 130 in here, but that can be high from areas. Don't shoot me if you're in the Midwest because I know it's lower. But based on your payer mix, that can give you in the ballpark of $10,000. Okay. Now, one concern folks would have here, and we need to be aware of this. So as groups start to do this, and we did the same thing, if we have folks that are coding one way, we're trying to get them to improve their coding, but there's inevitably going to be some of those folks stuck out way on the right here where they're risky to us, that they actually are coding for therapeutic activities in neuromuscular re-ed, but they're not describing it very well. So we say, well, if I start sniffing around, I might find those. The nice thing here is when we look at all the data that's been pulled over this year, 78% of what we look at, that discordance, so when the therapist coded one thing, but they described it as something else, 78% of the time, it's actually an opportunity. They coded lower than what they could have based on what they described. Only 22% of the time did they code for a high value code, therapeutic activities in neuromuscular re-ed, when in actuality, what they described was therapeutic exercise and NMR. And this is now a graph to show that. So this is across those therapists, again, the 50th percentile in the middle, and then those tails up here at the top and bottom. We can see there's all kinds of opportunity. When those therapists down here are discordant much of the time in their units, you're going to have all kinds of opportunity units down here. There's much less risk units when we get up here towards those tails. And really, the vast majority of the difference happens at these people that are way out. They're in the top decile, the top 10% of all providers. So it's not that you have to go to all your providers and say, oh boy, now we got to monitor everybody for being this overcoder or upcoder. It really is a very small percentage of the people that you're looking at are the ones who are creating the vast majority of that risk. So you just focus on those, get those few people, get that fixed. Now you can focus on the opportunity, which is the main thing that we want to focus on. So again, this is just a way to look at that. Average provider per month has 64 units of opportunity, only 19 units of risk. So really, if you take the difference between those two, they have a net of 45 units of opportunity. Even if you fix those that they're potentially coding too high on, and we get them to change those down, you're still going to come out significantly up on the process. Okay, so ultimately then what we need to look at is, we've given all this information. This is all retrospective. Really the key, and this is where my passion is in my practice, and Kelly's going to talk you through some technology for this. How do we give insights to our provider at the point of care to help them make this decision at the point of care, versus us having to come around to the tail end and try to counsel them to change something probably a month or two later, which is way too late. So I'll let Kelly go through some of the technology of that.
Yeah. So in this next slide, this is just and this is basically just showing how we've taken this AI model that we've just described earlier in this presentation, and we basically inlaid it into the EMR. So it's reading the text as the therapist is writing. So what you're seeing in the picture on the left-hand side here is all the different opportunities for the different interventions that were coded. And if it is a, checkbox like, yes, this was good, or if there is a warning of an opportunity to shift something different. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll actually see this working in real time. So what you'll see is as we're typing through this, you can see we're reading 4 therapeutic exercise. We're doing a warm up on treadmill, hamstring stretch, and it's giving us, yes, that's good. But then when we add a squat, it's actually telling us that there's a therapeutic activity with a 95% confidence that that could be something different. Now, in this particular example, we've actually built the capability to actually click on that little button there, and it actually moves it. Now, you'll also notice that it prompts the therapist to think about the units there as well. One of the things we, obviously want our therapists to be mindful of is if they're changing how they're documenting the interventions, that they're also thinking critically about how their units are applied to. And so what this actually allows us to do is to kind of get that change behavior, not only in the code selection, but also in the unit allocation for the specific therapist too. Now, this is an example of a too hot, too cold example where you're doing a functional exercise and you're coding it as therapeutic or you're doing a functional activity, you're coding it as therapeutic exercise. Now, when we go to the next slide, we have the opposite here. And so this is where it's a therapeutic activity that this therapist is coding, but, warm up on treadmill. And so we're saying like, and there's not quite enough justification there. So we're saying that there's, 92% confidence that this could be a therapeutic exercise. Again, this is all while they're documenting in the EMR. And so in this particular example, one thing I like to highlight here, to Chris's point, one of the things we don't want to uncover is all these, this risk, and that therapists are coding less because they're not justifying. So one of the things I like with this, and we don't have it in this specific example, but I do a lot of coaching with our therapists on this, is like, if your intent really is with an exercise to do something functional there, and if your intent is functional, you can change your justification for that intervention here until our AI says, check, yes, you have that justification, right? So it actually helps those therapists that really do have the intent to do a functional code. They just don't have the justification wording quite right. And so we actually can help with that as well. And so that's one of the things that as we're coaching our clients on how to utilize this, is to make sure that it's not just an automatic, like, okay, this is what I did, I'm going to shift it to exactly what the AI says, but using the AI to help you really get to the justification that you're doing for your critical thinking. And that's where, again, we are at Prediction Health, we're very, very conscientious to ensure that our therapists that we work with are making their best clinical decision-making skills. They're using it to make the decision on what's they're doing with their patients. We are not here to make the clinical decision for them. We're just here to help them see that their justification is there. So that's one of the things that has been obviously extraordinarily exciting in the industry and for us and for our clients as well. I'll hand it back to Chris.
All right. So if we started off on kind of the focus and focusing on those high value functional activities, therapeutic activities in neuromuscular re-ed, how do we end up kind of capturing the hearts of our providers? And really the key here is to help them to focus on working smarter, not harder. We all know, anyone who has managed a practice for any length of time knows it's effective in a short period of time to crack the whip over your folks and give them the smiley face, frowny face chart on their billing or their units or their productivity. But at the end of the day, if we can off-burden them, it's going to end up helping them do the right thing, and they'll get value out of it, as will the organization. So the key here is we want to try to effectively turn the minutes that they're spending with the patient into units, making sure that those units, they're being thoughtful about it so they can get the most out of those, not unethically, but just make sure they're getting paid for what they're worth. And then that helps them to use their clinical time the most effectively. So this ultimately, I'll kick back to Kelly, but this relates to the 8-minute rule and where we have opportunities to play with those things based on how we can kind of nudge on our providers at the course of care.
So obviously this is a slide highlighting the 2 most frequent payer rules. This isn't a coding presentation. However, I did want to highlight the total minute rule and the AMA rule. And the next sequence of slides that we have, we will be utilizing the total minute rule and doing some analysis around that. We did not include the AMA analysis since it is so payer specific. So just to be clear about that. So if we go into the next slide, what we're showing here is that we're actually looking at the monthly unit pickup opportunity per therapist for just the Medicare visit with the total minute rule. And so what we've done is we've looked at, for the visits here, how many minutes did they spend with them? And then how many units did they bill for the minutes they spent with the therapist? And so if we move to the next slide, what we'll actually see is this bottom quartile here where we have the most opportunity. Now, the next slide actually expands that out, and we've actually done an analysis for that bottom quartile of providers. We have 10 unit pickup opportunity here. So basically what we can see is another $340 per provider per month if we can educate those therapists on how to best select how to apply the appropriate units for the number of minutes that they're spending with those with their patients. Now, on the next slide, we're showing just for initial evaluations. And so this was something that as I started working with more and more of our clients, I found this to be quite interesting because we see pretty consistently across the board where therapists have a misunderstanding of how to use the untimed codes within an evaluation. And so here's what we're looking at is the percentage of 30 or more minute Medicare evals with only 1 unit. And here's where we're seeing, again, if we go to the next slide, it's a small percentage. We're looking at, the bottom 10% of therapists, but you can imagine there's a lot of opportunity here to capture whole units because your therapists are not actually coding for the amount of time that they're with their patients. And so if you go to the next slide, we have that blown up just a little bit more. And so here what we can see is the bottom 10% of providers have 15% of their evals of 30 or more minutes that only have 1 unit. And so again, to what I just said, like essentially what they're doing is they're not coding for any treatment that they did in their evaluation. Now, what I always talk to our therapists about is, number one, I like to ask the question is, did you really not perform any treatment in those evaluations? The answer is likely, well, yeah, of course I did. Like, I don't know a therapist that can't, educate about posture or about something when they're with their patients that first visit. And so what we're seeing is the therapists are just coding for the eval. And they're not actually coding for what they're doing from the treatment perspective, likely because there's a misunderstanding around how to utilize the untimed code or exactly how to code for your time during an evaluation. But again, we do see some opportunity with this particular the evaluations and utilization of those untimed codes. So now if we go to the next slide, we did an additional analysis here. So basically where we're looking at the Medicare initial evaluations. We're seeing how many unit pickup opportunities we have for each of those evals. So what we're seeing on the y-axis is the percentage of initial evals. So that's basically the number of initial evals here. And then across the x-axis is the total treatment time per minutes. Now we also have a color coding here where the orange is the highest opportunity for more unit pickup. And then the white is where we have the lowest opportunity, which means they're utilizing their minutes to apply the most appropriate units in that length of time. And so what we see here is the 30-minute has the darkest orange, the 45 and the 60. And so we can see that we have this kind of this Goldilocks thing where we have this like too short, where therapists are only coding for, they have a lot of opportunity to bill another unit, or it's too long and they're not using their time very wisely and they're billing too long for the initial evals and they're not actually getting treatment time based on the total minute rule. Now, what we also see here, and this is very fascinating to me, is that 40-minute evaluation time we're actually seeing is just right. It has the least opportunity for unit pickup, which means that the therapists are using their time wisely and they are coding most effectively for the units in the amount of time they're spending with their patients. And so this is where it's kind of fascinating to me to think about the psychology around time. Like 30 minutes, we don't feel like we have enough time to get an eval and treatment. 60 minutes, we kind of, really, really just take our time. We talk to our patients a long time. And of course, there's kind of, we all have our anecdotal stories about maybe our own examples there, but then also working with patients in that, or working with therapists in that particular realm as well. Now, the next slide we're looking at is same analysis, but now we're looking at follow-up visits. And so here's what we're seeing is that the longer the follow-up visits, the more, and again, on the graph, we have the percentage of visits on the y-axis, and then we have the total treatment minutes on the x-axis, and then the darker, the orange, is the most unit pickup opportunities. And what we can see here is the longer the visit, the least effective the therapists are in coding for the appropriate number of units or the most pickup opportunity they have. And so here's where we can see, 60-minute treatment minutes have the highest unit pickup rate to follow up. So again, not necessarily the most effective way to utilize your time when we can see in the data that therapists are not coding correctly for those particular length of visits. I'll hand it over to Chris to continue.
Great. I'll put one point here because I think this is a place that we're at right now, which we need to work through. Is at least on the West Coast. I'm not sure if this is true nationwide, but we have a ton of therapists telling us that I would like to have hour-long evals. I need hour-long evals, and I need to have hour-long follow-ups. I need an hour with my patients. And we even have some folks leaving our practice. Many folks actually leaving our practice, going to practices where they offer hour-long treatments. Lots of reasons why they'd want to do that. We can get into, again, a long conversation of why they're asking for that. I frankly wouldn't have a problem with it except for this graph. And so what we would need to talk with these folks is say, okay, well, one, why do you need an hour? I think because there's probably inefficiencies and we can make your life better and get more done in a shorter amount of time, but that's another story. But the problem is when we go up to 60 minutes, as Kelly said, there's more loose time in that visit, that follow-up visit, and they're not being efficient with that use of time. If they actually build efficiently in that 60 minutes, they can make great use of that time. Now, they block new patients, so there might have an overall negative effect on your revenue, but they'd at least be making the best use of the time that they're with, but they're not right now. So how do we get them to improve that if we were to offer that? I'm not saying that we should, because we frankly have a shortage of therapists right now. And if you fill up all your spots with not enough, all your time with not enough patient slots, we've got another problem. But I just want to point out that we've got this problem, folks asking for an hour and them being inefficient. So that difference gives you an opportunity to have a conversation with folks and potentially see if you can come to some common ground. All right, so last little bit here is we're going to focus back on the evaluation. So this is a kind of there's a lot going on in this graph, so I'm gonna help unpack it a little bit. So this is the total treatment minutes. We're looking at just evaluations again. So we have evaluations ranging anywhere from 20 minutes on the left here up to over 70 minutes on the right. That's the x-axis. And then we look at how many dollars they're producing from that evaluation visit, ranging on the low end here from about $100 up to the high end here to 260-ish. Big difference. These are all evaluation visits. And we also have taken the payer piece out. We're based just on RVUs and an average. So these differences are not related to payer differences. These differences are related to what the therapist is doing or not doing. So we'll start there. One area to focus on is this group down here. So the color is scaled up here. These are providers that give 1 unit of care. Those providers that give 2, all the way up to, I don't know how you would do this, and ethics come in, but 8 units up here. And so again, this is for an eval visit. So we look at this 1 unit, and this actually, we have folks with a 20-minute eval. I'd make the case you'd be hard pressed to do meaningful treatment and evaluation in 20 minutes. It's doable in simple cases, but then we also go all the way up to those folks seeing the patient for an hour and billing for 1 unit. Oh, as a practice owner, that's a killer. And not just from a practice owner, from a patient. I've sat, if that truly happened and there was no care given, I just sat here with the provider in pain, describing my agony, and they just listened and tested, probably made me worse, and sent me home. So from a value perspective and from a business perspective, holy schmoly, there's a problem here with a one unit evaluation. If we go up here now to those that are 2-unit evaluations, we still can see a gap. So this difference between the top and the bottom of these folks seeing 2 units is roughly $30. This difference is based to what they've done. It's not based on an extra unit. What we find here is this jump from here to here, that 2 units on many folks down in this point where there's this big, there's a equal distribution top to bottom. It has to do with modalities. So we have, if you're going to get a second unit, a lot of these folks in these shorter evaluation times are using modalities to get that second unit, where if you have more time, you're more likely to be doing something of high value. Okay, still, you're only getting 2 units out of a 60-minute eval, so that's still not great, but at least it's better than doing a modality as that second unit. If you now then go up to, and I'll get rid of these drawings, go up to now a 3-unit, we can see that there's a little less of those up here than there were down at the green below. And so I'll go to the next slide. Oops. But what we can see here is the key here is there's still going to be some modality use here, but there's the overall difference between the 2-unit and the 3-unit. They're likely doing something of meaning there as they get up to that 3rd unit. They're not doing an evaluation plus 2 modalities. Okay, and then last piece here, if we jump up to the 4-unit, which is going to be the most common in that 60-minute eval, we see here from top to bottom of just this section. So from here to here, there's a $60 gap from top to bottom. Again, nothing to do with payer, having everything to do with the quality. So now we're really starting to get wider and wider. So there's a lot of variability inside of those hour-long evals that are billing 4 units. Now it's based on what you are actually doing. This is a shift Therapeutic Associates made probably about 10 years ago. We stopped talking about units as much as RVUs. Before that, we were like, well, a therapist doesn't know what an RVU is. They know what units are. We're just going to ride units. We found out, and now more recently, Prediction Health has helped us to validate that it's actually less about the units. It's more about RVUs. And that's actually an easier conversation because you're talking about giving valuable things to your patient. Again, this is focused on that evaluation visit only, but this carries through to the other visits as well. Okay, so last little bit is how do we focus on improving efficiency? So we in this last part, we talked about how do you make the best use of the time that you're spending with the patient. Now, how can we actually make the therapist's life better? And this for me is this is it. If you want your therapist to change, you can browbeat them, you can incentivize them, but at the end of the day, if you just make it easy to do the right thing, that's actually going to be where you're going to get most effect. So Kelly's going to talk us through some of the functionality that helps with that, and it relates to some of the things they've talked about already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the next portion that we're talking about here is, again, kind of back to that, helping at the point of documentation, right? So we previously talked about the CPT code selection, how to help our therapists make the right decision. Here, what we're talking about is how can we drive efficiency through helping with documentation generation. And so this particular section here, and Chris, I'll have you go to the next slide. This is actually showing an example of an assessment generation tool that we've built that basically helps to, you can see here, and what's showing here is actually like a sentence completing feature. So where our AI is working in the background to read the information of the subjective section of the note so that when you're in the assessment, it will either give you examples in the box below of sentences that you can use, or it will actually generate sentences here, as you can see in the box, where you can actually accept those suggestions. So for those of you that use Gmail, Gmail has that functionality. It's a type ahead functionality. It kind of gives you like an expected, like how you could complete that sentence. We've built that same thing, but trained on physical therapy and our AI models. And so this has, we've been launching this with some of our clients. We've seen substantial improvement in time efficiencies. This is something I'm particularly passionate about. It's one of the things that I struggled with, obviously, as a therapist working for years. And I was really passionate about being as efficient as possible. I ended up being the EMR trainer for the company that I used to work for. And then I left practice to join Prediction Health, knowing that they could impact us so much in this particular portion of our industry. Now, we know that this is a huge driver for burnout. We have so many regulations around documentation. It's fatiguing. It's extraordinarily fatiguing as a therapist to try to get all of this done, as well as be empathetic, as well as make the best clinical decision making, all of the things that are required of a therapist. Now, this is really great, but as we kind of move through here, we want to make sure that the quality of our documentation is also up to par. And so I'm going to go through some of our compliance information that we have. And I believe is that, yeah. So I want to kind of go through that. Chris, I'll have Chris kind of highlight that beforehand, but yeah, Chris, I'll hand it over to you. Sorry, I got ahead of my.
Yeah, so this will go back to Kelly, but the key is going to be that we struggled with this as an organization. So likely many of you do if you don't have a formal or an external auditing process. So we would either require our compliance committee to do random audits on all of our providers, which is woefully inadequate, and it's just a burden on that group, or we would actually take our providers out of clinic each month, a certain number of hours, and have them do chart reviews on their peers. So this peer chart review. So the way to look at compliance, do you have a plan of care? Do you have goals written? Do you have a subjective and physical examination that's in compliance with your Practice Act? These are all things that we all struggle as practice managers and owners to make sure it's compliant. And really, if we're honest with ourselves, we have the kind of the dartboard approach. We close our eyes and just throw it, and we just hope upon hope that the dart landed on one that was meaningful. What Prediction Health is now allowing us to do, back to where Ravi started, is they're reading every sentence of every note, and from that they can do that real-time audit. So rather than looking at every body one-off and hoping you catch a bad note, they actually can give you insights and really focus yourselves down to those people that need to be addressed.
So if we go to Chris's point here, if we can automate those manual reviews, so not only do we take that off of the compliance team or off the leadership, right? Like we have a lot of our companies that the owner is doing audits, and it's like they have a lot of other things that they could do with their time that could be more valuable to their company and to the growth of their company or the happiness of their therapists, but they have to spend their time doing these audits. So we take that off of their plate, and we also take it off the therapist's plate. And so here's an example, again, to kind of go back to how we looked at this with the CPT coding. Here's an example of how the AI model works, where we're reading unstructured text. So any of the free text within the note, we're seeing, an example of picking up heavy objects makes the pain worse. So our AI is saying, hey, we have picking up heavy objects, we have makes the pain worse. That is the prediction, or the label that we would apply to that is an aggravating factor. Now, to Ravi's point earlier, language is complex, and we know that there's a lot of nuances to that sentence. It doesn't mean just one thing. And so we actually have other labels. We actually apply all of our labels, which we have over 100 labels that we apply to each sentence. And so you can see, sorry, Chris, go back to the previous one really quick. So you can see here that we can actually apply the activity limitations and the aggravating factors, as well as activity, hobbies, or social history. So the blue here will actually, the darker the blue, the higher the confidence is that is what the label is applying to, that's what that sentence is. So this allows us to put multiple meanings and multiple labels to one specific sentence, which means we can have a robust understanding of the documentation quality. So now if we go to the next slide, here is, I understand this is a very busy slide, but essentially what this is highlighting, for just initial evaluations, what are the components that we are actually measuring for? So in the first column, you'll see it's initial eval. The second column is the component. The third column is the subcomponent that would map to that component. And then a description is in the following column. We also have some of our criteria that's required in best practice. For best practice, for instance, aggravating, alleviating factors, like it's obviously best practice to make sure to document that when it comes to the description of condition in your eval. However, if you're missing it, then you're not going to get docked, or you're not going to fail an audit. So we have it as best practice. It's important to have in there, but it's not necessarily a failing requirement. Now, as we go on to the next one, here's where we have all the components of the follow-up, as well as the subcomponents and the description, and if it's required. And then the next slide here, we have the progress visits as well. Now, with these particular components, the progress visit is interesting because we really, and I'll highlight this in just a moment, but progress visit, we're really looking for phrasing in the subjective and the assessment around how the patient has progressed in the last reporting period. And that's one of the things, I do a lot of analysis of this with our therapists, and we see, therapists write a progress note and they just write it like a daily note. They don't actually do the critical thinking to say like, okay, how did that patient do within the last 10 days and why do they need to continue with me? If we go to the next slide, this slide is actually showing the components with the greatest opportunity for improvement, ranked in order. And so based on the component list that we looked on the last 3 slides, the component that has the lowest compliance score the most frequently is the initial evaluation justification for skilled therapy service, or the assessment in the evals. Now, I'm not surprised when I first saw this. I was like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. And then the initial eval description of condition is the second most common component that scored poorly. And then we have the response to prior treatment in the follow-up visits, and then the updated analysis on how the patient performed, or the assessment in the follow-up, and then the assessment in the progress visits. So, and then of course it's ranked as you kind of continue down here. Now, one of the things I like to highlight in the top 5 problems we have in compliance in our, from what we've analyzed, is the assessment portion in our documentation, which tells me our therapists cannot concisely document what they're doing in a way that actually is saying like, hey, this is how the patient's doing and this is why they need to continue. Which again comes back to that real-time thing where we can actually use our models to write compliant sentences to help the therapist's brain work. And I always think like, I always joke, I can't tell you how many times you be with a patient, you're, in between patients or something, and in between you have maybe like 2 or 3 minutes in between a patient, and you sit down to try to write that assessment, and your mind is tired and it just goes blank. And it's like, okay, and so if you have something kind of cueing you and prompting you, like, hey, here's some phrases you can use, it's just going to kickstart your brain to start doing that. It's also going to suggest things to you that you might not think of using otherwise. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've used the same phrases, in note to note to note. So giving you just kind of alternative ways to say the same things can be very helpful when it comes to a fatigued therapist that's, seen 10 patients in a day, is trying to get their notes done. So then as we scroll down, one of the things that we were really interested to look at as we started collecting data and working with our clients over the past few years, and Robbie and I have been working together now for over 2 years, and we constantly are like, okay, I wonder what we're going to find with this and this. And so we get to, working with folks like Chris, who also inspires us to ask all these interesting questions too. What we actually have identified is some patterns around compliance. Now, the next slides we go over are likely not going to be super surprising to anybody, but it's really, really nice to see these graphs and to have like firm data that we're actually seeing that this is real. So on this particular graph, what we're seeing is on the y-axis, we're seeing the frequency. So basically how many times this is happening. And then on the x-axis, we're seeing the hours to the first note sign off. So you can see the 0, to 25 was within the first 24 hours after the time of patient care. So they're actually seeing the patient. And then it kind of lingers on there up to 200 hours later. Now, the color coordination, the green is a good compliance score, down to a red or into the yellows here, where it's a lower compliance score. So what you can see on this graph, to I'm sure no one's surprise, is that the further away you get from that time of service, the lower the compliance score is. So again, most of us are not surprised by this. However, this is where we can really talk to our therapists about the importance of not just point of contact documentation, but also getting our documentation done timely so that we have the most compliant and accurate notes we can have. Now, if we go to the next slide, this slide is actually looking at the time of day of signature. So this is when the notes are signed in the time of day, and then the compliance score. So again, on the y-axis, we're seeing the frequency, and then on the x-axis, we're seeing the hour of the first note sign off. So this is the initiating signature. So we have 0 would be midnight, and then, all the way through the early morning. On the left-hand side of the graph, the green, again, we're seeing higher compliance scores. That's going to be during the day, like during the workday. And then we start to get red into that late night, Now, one thing I find fascinating here is we have a lot of frequency of notes being signed off at the end of the day. So that's what this is showing us here. Those high bars at those last 4 or 5 are the end of the day. Those are the late night time frames, the late night hours, but they have low compliance scores. So those providers in your organization that wait till the end of the day to sign all their notes, the likelihood is they're going to have poor compliance scores there. And we're seeing that in the data. Now, one thing our CEO likes to highlight is there's this little drop off here around like that 1 p.m. So he likes to call that the coffee. You need to get the extra coffee to kind of dip back up into your good compliance there. So it's just one of those things that this is, again, nothing that we're necessarily super shocked by. But again, it's really nice to see the data.
Yeah.
Now, the next graph.
Can I interject one thing here? This came up
Yeah.
through one question. We'll answer this question a little more at the end, but so you might ask yourself, well, how do you have this conversation? How can you leverage this conversation? So what we do is we look for this. We actually have a team that looks for this. This pajama time is what this has been known as, the documenting late in the day. And first of all, we just say, I bet you as a provider don't like documenting at home in your pajamas, right? And so if all we do is say, I'd like to do all these things to help you not document in your pajamas at home. We think that it's wrong. We know it's hard on you and you're going to burn out. There's research to show us you're going to burn out when you do more of that. So can we do everything we can to help you do more of your documentation during the day? Let's make a plan for that. That's the totality of our intervention. What this data shows us is if that's what you focus on, you just get them to sign their note off earlier in the day, they're automatically going to bill better. And so we're going to end up having better opportunities when we do things for our providers, not browbeating them on other things. I'll talk about it in other ways at the end.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. And then this final graph we have here, this is where we actually do a measurement in our platform where we're measuring the amount of characters that we have in documentation, and we can actually measure over documentation. And so here what we're actually looking at is a compliance score related to the number of characters that are in a note. And so what we can see here is we have this sweet spot where we have about 5,000 characters in a note, but we have a really good compliance score. So we're between into that like 80 to 100. Now, what I really like to highlight here is there's this exponential kind of movement upward that the more characters you have, the better your score gets, right? Like that's pretty obvious. Like you have to have a minimum amount of information. But then after that, you have diminishing returns. All you're doing is just spending more time doing documentation, but you're not getting any better score. And so what we're seeing here is like, there's some of those folks, you can see they have the same score, but they have 20,000 characters in their documentation compared to a therapist that has 5,000 characters, but has the same audit score. And so again, how can we kind of get our therapists into this sweet spot here where we know it's possible to do, and can we coach them or provide a tool that actually can help them find that sweet spot? And so this is something, in my own career, I was really focused on trying to get therapists to get to that spot. Now we have a lot of tools with this. Chris can kind of highlight some of the, again, kind of the action items behind this, but we do find that it is possible to have a low amount of characters, and which again correlates to how long it would take you to do that documentation, but still have good compliance scores where it's not necessarily the more is better here. And so again, kind of highlighting the, what strategies can help improve compliance. Here's where we can really start to get into the documentation generation here. So back to some of this real-time functionality. So here's where we actually have the providers that are documenting compliantly. We actually have goal generation here. We have assessment generation. Again, using an AI model trained on compliant sentences and using the information in the actual subjective to generate these assessment and these goals. So again, we want to drive efficiency. We want to ensure compliance, and we want to make sure those therapists aren't doing that pajama time. I might even venture to say, Chris, maybe wine time too, like doing pajamas and a glass of wine in hand. So those are one of the things that we really want to, of course, help our therapists with. And I like Chris's point, like this is a tool where we're using it we're using an industry that we have really, really tight margins. And it's one of those things that we can actually do something for our therapists that make our therapists feel like we're taking care of them and we care about them. But it also can impact us in a positive way financially too. And to Chris's point, it's not just harping on them on making the right decisions and putting more on their shoulders. It's actually reducing their burden, but still helping them make the right decisions. And here's just another example here of that real-time functionality, that type ahead functionality. This is actually an example in like a subjective portion where you could use that type ahead functionality. So like I said, the assessment generation, the goal generation, and here's an example of a subjective type ahead functionality. As you're with the patient, it's suggesting to you, hey, you've written these things, this low back pain started 3 months ago, tripped and fell, all these different things. And now you can actually go in and see how that looks.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So here, as we wrap up, I'll just share, I love the points that Chris and Kelly were making. And it reminds me of one of my favorite papers from grad school was actually it was about hospital prescribing practices. The hospital wanted their providers to prescribe more generic medications, and they took the browbeating approach, and that doesn't really move the needle that much. They did some amount of education, and that helps a little bit, making some progress. But then the real big win was when they finally changed the order in the pick list and actually made it easy for the provider to do the right thing at the point of care while they were doing their documentation and ordering. And so really excited about some of these features where we can just help the provider get it right the first time and do their work more efficiently and as mentioned, take care of them. And so today, we went over a little background on AI and focused on how we can use functional activities to drive strong finances and happy patients, how we can help our therapists work smarter, not harder, and how we can actually have a process to really address compliance and make sure that we're having quality documentation supporting and really demonstrating the great care that so many physical therapists provide. To wrap up here, just wanted to go around the horn and see if check if Kelly or Chris, you had any final thoughts that you wanted to share, and then we'll take some questions.
Yeah, anything, Kelly?
I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you all for having us here.
Awesome. In that case, we have two in the chat here. We have two questions. First one, and Chris, maybe I think this is maybe the one you were addressing a little bit before, but question, can you go more in depth with PT adaptability and learning curves?
Yeah, Sagan, can you, where's Sagan on this now? Is Sagan on? Can they give a little more insight? Otherwise, I can take it from what I think the part of the question. Let's see, Sagan on. So I'll start just from how we've done it with our providers. We have taken the approach that it's not a learning exercise as much as it's an understanding exercise. And so, and yes, everyone's going to have to learn to do something a different way. But if we can understand why folks are doing, one, who are the folks we need to focus on? That's the first thing, because you don't have to actually address everyone for all of these factors. There's a very small subsection of your folks that you actually have to intervene on. And so one, finding them. Two, understanding them. And so the depth of the data you can get from this, coupled with other things you can do in your practice, and talking to them to understand, hey, we've seen this, it's non-threatening, we just see this thing, your coding compared to our benchmark is lower. Can you help me to understand why that might be? So helping, one, that individual to self-reflect, but then you to understand. If we're saying we want to train so that the person will do something, this is my area of research, and really this is tied to, from a technology standpoint, there are some frameworks that kind of predict whether a person's going to use a process or do a thing you want them to do. And in the end, it's really about, does that person think that it's easy? Does that person think like it's going to make their life better? Is somebody that they respect say that they should do the thing? And then has the company done something to make it easy for them to do the thing that they want? It's really that simple. There's a habit one that sticks out there, and that's the hard one. But those four. So really, while yes, we need to train our folks, we have taken the approach to say, technologically, can we just make it really easy for you to do the right thing? And then can we understand where the focus is? For us, it's really been on that time of day sign off, and then thinking about the code, being thoughtful of describing what you've done. If I had to give one piece of advice and one piece of advice only of a place to start with your providers, it would be to say, we need to better describe what we do in our codes. If that's the only thing you do, you're going to be more concordant with what the AI says. Now, those folks are probably going to chart longer because they're just going to put more words down. So we're going to have to come back and put some guards on it. But that has made the biggest change in our organization. And then ultimately, again, make it easy for them to do it. So give them guidelines and framework for how they can document to the point of care without having to do it at night, so that they can, again, do the things you want them to do. Any more you want to add on that, Kelly?
No, I think that's great. And actually, Chris, that might, there's a question from Blaine, asking about, with the CPT Insights AI, when as a non-clinician, if you're getting pushback from a PT about what Prediction Health is saying, I'd be curious your own kind of response to that, Chris. Like, what do you tell a therapist when, and I have my own answer to that, but I'm curious about your answer too.
Yeah, I would start with, let's put coding aside. What's the most if we just look at a patient, what's the most valuable thing to your patient that we do? We teach them to move better. We improve their movement patterns so that they can live their life with a better movement pattern, and that's going to persist past our visit. I'm a fellow of the American Academy. I love manual therapy. And at the end of the day, manual therapy is about this important compared to all the other stuff we do. So, and I don't think any provider would question us on that. So what's the most valuable? Cool. If we agree on that, do we think that most of our visits should consist of the stuff that's the most valuable? For sure. Great. The last thing we would say is, do you think you should accurately describe what you code? Yeah. Cool. Then let's focus on that. Focus on doing the high value things for your patient. And let's focus on making sure that those things match, that you're describing well what you do. And let's see what happens. And I bet the problem takes care of itself. If it doesn't, then we can start to harp on, okay, 97530. I would, if a person's really adamant, we've had this before where a person says, I'm billing TheraX and that's what I'm doing. A squat to improve function of the VMO so that they can return to mountain climbing. That for me is therapeutic exercise, and I will never change my mind. I would ask, or they say, I just need to do lots of long arc quads. I would ask them, why can't the patient do that at home? Why can't the patient go to their personal trainer and do that? You are doing very low skilled care if you have to do high TheraX care, at least through the course of your visit. So I wouldn't browbeat anyone. I would just come to agreement.
And then I would also add, from like the Prediction Health standpoint, when we're looking at the specific examples, like one of the things to kind of like expand on what Chris is saying is like, we really want to think about this on a high level. Like the examples that we have from Prediction Health, which of course is extraordinarily valuable, so we can actually see examples from each therapist's note on what we're actually analyzing. That's really to give us a sense of how they're doing when they're selecting their codes to start the conversation. There, of course, are going to be some things, because we can't read the minds of the therapist. We can only make our best judgment based on the interventions that are written. And so because of that, we will of course be off a little bit when we are, specifically to the clinician's intention. So there are some examples of where therapists go, actually, I was doing, again, Chris, like I was doing squats for quad strength. Now, if that happens so frequently, then there's a conversation to be had there. But if it happens, one or two times, and then they transition into neuro or transition into therapeutic activity, then maybe that makes sense. But again, it's one of those things that we're really trying to feed to Chris's point as earlier in the presentation, is find those therapists that are your outliers, because those are impossible to find unless you have this data. Who are the therapists on the coding perspective and on the unit perspective, and then kind of work with those therapists to ensure that they're making changes. I will answer.
Yeah, sorry, one other question. I'll give a quick one, and I'm interested in your thoughts on prompt. So there's a question that someone uses prompt. Sam said they use prompt, and they're wondering if house-made templates are accurate and good to use. This is an area of my focus in therapeutic associates. Heck yeah. I mean, we've shown, and Prediction Health has picked this up based on how we formed our templates that helped our outcome score. This comes back to the make it easy for the provider to do what you want them to do. My only ask would be for you as a business owner to understand the algorithms, the things that Kelly showed in that graph that make up a good compliance score, and then make your templates do that. So just make it darn easy for your providers to do the right things.
Right. And then I'll add, Prompt has some house templates that they've created, and we actually have our own templates that we give as like suggested templates to our clients. And so, which anyone can find on our ptsupport.predictionhealth.com website. We have suggested templates there. We do have that particular document is agnostic to EMR. So it's not specific to prompt necessarily, or WebPT or clinicians or any of the others. But what we do have is tailored to the things that are required within our compliance score. And so that's where I would, so when I work with our clients, what we typically do is we take that document and then we compare it to any of the templates that they currently have, or the things that they know, like in prompt, there's a table that they fill out for pain. And so you wouldn't necessarily need to fill out the pain section, excuse me, for your evals. You would just, do the section in prompt. So there are ways to ensure that the templates are compliant by utilizing ours to kind of help with that.